So my name is Debbie Donovan. I am with Endogastric Solutions, and we are a company that makes a device that's used in a procedure to treat acid reflux. So I am in the upper GI space, and I'm introducing myself that way because as I go down the line, I would like each of our panelists to introduce themselves based on their experience in which areas that specialty areas that they are coming from their point of view. So we'll start with Matt Reifenberger.
Great. No, thank you, Debbie. My name is Matt Reifenberger, and I'm with Edwards Lifesciences, which is just around the corner here. We are a global company that is an industry leader in structural heart valve and aortic stenosis valve replacement technologies. We heard Stan talk this morning, if you heard Stan Rowe talk this morning about the TAVR story, it's a really compelling story. I sit within our health economics and reimbursement team at Edwards Lifesciences, where I wear a couple different hats. One is to support the surgical side of our business, which we're still very excited about the surgical side of our business. There's still a lot of innovation there. And within that role, I think a lot about the value of those technologies and how to convey the value of those technologies to a diverse group of stakeholders. And then the second hat that I wear is to keep an eye on the policy front coming out of DC, especially as it relates to Medicare. A lot of our patients are Medicare patients. So it's been a fascinating year, and I know we'll get into that, moving from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, and there's been some really interesting news just within the past few weeks of some changes in some of the policy areas that we're going to talk about. So.
Great, thank you. So Belinda Mohr.
Hi, everyone. Oh, can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm Belinda Mohr, and I've been with Gore Associates for about 6 years now. I am their lead health economist. I'm on the global health economics team, so similar team that Matt is on. And I work on our covered stents for aortic aneurysms, peripheral arterial disease, as well as vascular grafts for our dialysis access business. We do also have some occluders and structural heart and another business on the East Coast. Gore is known for their Gore-Tex. If anybody of you know their fabric, that's what Gore is absolutely known for, and that same technology is what is used in a lot of our products. So we are a technology firm, and we have a medical device division within that. It is part of my commitment to not only identify what that value is to the many different stakeholders, but to quantify it. So I am definitely the technical person who is in the weeds of all the data, doing the analysis and trying to figure out if there is value there. So that's my role.
All right. So now we have Reggie Groves.
Hi, I'm Reggie Groves, obviously. I'm CEO of Reva Medical. We make a bioresorbable coronary scaffold that is just being commercialized in Europe now. We received CE mark in April, our first product going commercial. Prior to coming to Reva 2 years ago, I was at Medtronic, and the relevant positions there, I built and ran Medtronic's atrial fibrillation ablation business, and I, before that, ran the quality and regulatory for the cardiac rhythm division, and before that, I launched the first remote device check business in the US.
Great, thank you. And now we have Suzanne Winter from Medtronic.
From Medtronic. Yeah. So I'm Suzanne Winter. I'm the Vice President of the Americas region for Medtronic's Diabetes business. And I'm responsible for the commercial organization across the Americas region, but I also have the responsibility for establishing strategic partnerships with payers, providers, health systems, as well as employer groups, and really developing new business models and value-based healthcare arrangements. And so I have been with Medtronic for 2 years, and so it's been a journey in the 2 years, I think, in value-based healthcare. So it's been actually very fun for me. Prior to that, I actually came from the diagnostic imaging business. I was with GE Healthcare for many years. And also, I worked for a startup here in Orange County called Alcius Corporation, which was in the neurocritical care and cardiac arrest neuroprotection space. And we ultimately sold off to Zoll Medical. So I have a little bit of big company and small company experience.
Right. Okay, so what we decided as a panel is that it would be really important for us to define what we think of when we think of value-based healthcare. So actually, I'd like to kick it off with Reggie. And if you could just talk to us a little bit about value-based healthcare as it relates to regulatory approvals, because that defines specific definition there.
Sure. So first, macro definition, I like to point to Michael Porter's definition. I think it's the most studied and talked about and documented definition, right? Which is outcome divided by the dollar of cost to get to that outcome, where outcome is defined by the patient's view of outcome, and cost obviously is the total cost of delivering care. There are lots of challenges with that definition of value-based, and there's lots of tensions with them. So I think the one example which I would talk about in terms of the regulatory is this tension of bringing innovation forward quickly so that we improve outcome, right? And hopefully not at a higher cost, or that there's enough improvement in outcome that it offsets the cost so that your metric is going the right direction, with the tension of how much proof do you need to know that you're going to have the right impact on the value-based metric. And I think that's a real tension that we have in this country. And the example that I would put out there, because it's one I lived a long time ago, is implantable defibrillator leads. So in the 1990s in this country, about 10,000 people died a year from sudden cardiac death. The advent of an implantable defibrillator was the start of beginning to help people who were at high risk for sudden cardiac death to be able to survive that death experience. The first lead, so you had the can, which could monitor and provide the shock, and you had the lead in the heart, which did all the monitoring, the measuring, and delivery. And the first lead had a 10-year survival rate of something like 78%. And the second lead, second generation, was in the market 2.5 years later, and it had a 10-year survival at 95% or more. And the third, 2.5 years later, had a 98% survival rate at 10 years. And the fourth came out 2.5 years later and had an 80-something% 10-year survival. So we went better, 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 worse, right? And the calls at the time that fourth generation was recalled were the FDA approved it too quickly. You should have had a longer time frame before you approved that technology to know you've got the right value. So I just did some Reggie math, so don't take this to the bank, but I looked at the number of leads implanted by each generation, and if we had demanded a 5-year clinical trial instead of what was at the time about a 6-month follow-up, we would have had about 50,000 more people in the United States have a lead failure over the course of time. If we had had a 5-year time frame for the last lead, we would have saved about 30,000 failures. So the net impact of delaying approval would have meant 20,000 more people had a lead failure. How do you really measure value, and what do you do with the regulatory system to bring that value fast, and what risks are you willing to take?
If I can,
Yeah,
just
so
to jump
Matt.
in on the outcomes piece of that, what's really interesting, and I agree with your definition of outcomes over cost, is when it comes to outcome is how do you measure those outcomes? Which ones are important to your therapeutic space? In which patient populations do you measure those in? Over what period of time? And those are areas that I know we all spend a lot of time thinking about. If you heard Stan this morning talk about the TAVR story in the First in Man, and that was in a patient who was basically on his deathbed, and he's, the risk benefit there made a lot of sense. We started in that inoperable patient population and then moved to high risk and then intermediate risk, and now we've got studies going on at low risk. So when you think about outcomes, I think it's important to keep in mind what are those outcomes, what do you actually measure, and over what period of time.
It's actually, Suzanne.
And I was just going to
Go right ahead.
and I'm in agreement with the way it's defined. I think in terms of the next step, which is how do you set up a business model whereby you are are aligned with the providers and the payers in the cost of care and the outcomes associated with any therapy or any device. And I think that's really where you have to move toward you're both taking on some risk. You're no longer just being compensated for the device with a promise of an outcome, but that you're now being tied to an outcome. Your compensation is now being tied to an outcome.
And I will just add, I agree with the definition of value, absolutely. And value means different things to different people. So it's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. You have to really think about the stakeholder. If you're thinking about specific providers for these risk-based agreements, every provider is going to want a different kind of agreement. Not every provider is the same. And same with the physician. Not every physician cares about the same thing. It's amazing what you end up seeing when you start talking about value, because people have their own definitions, and patients will think about very different things as well. So it's thinking about your device, thinking about, okay, who am I going to really target with this device? Who's the patient population? And what can I bring to them? And the time frame also, very important. The patient outcomes. Is that something that you can show within 30 days, a year, 5 years? Do people care at 5 years? Do people care at 10 years? Same with the cost savings. When do people care about the cost savings? Is 10-year cost saving enough? This isn't the United Kingdom where they might care about that. So it's very interesting how you have to think about all of those little intricacies. It's all the little details that really do matter.
So I think with those definitions in mind, I'd like to ask Matt to talk about how the new administration is defining value-based healthcare versus what we saw in the last administration. We'll start off with you.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating topic, and I'll use an analogy, and we'll see if that generates some discussion. But if in the previous administration, the Obama administration, maybe they were going in the car, maybe 50, 60 miles an hour, they had fee-for-service in the rearview mirror, and they were heading towards a value-based payment system. I think now, if you look at just what's happened in the past year, we've either eased off of that a little bit, or maybe the analogy is we're trying to find a new direction to get to a value-based payment system. I don't think anyone believes we've done a 180 and are heading back to the old fee-for-service, because there's a lot of issues with that. But the direction and how fast we're going to get there, I think, has changed, and I'll give just a couple quick examples. One of the things the Affordable Care Act did was it authorized and funded a center called CMMI, which is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation. And it was this center, CMMI, that was pushing out a lot of the different payment demonstrations and models. You saw a lot of Medicare ACO models coming out of there. They had models on end-stage renal disease. There's oncology care models. And there was another type of model called a bundled payment model. And those, if you're not familiar with the bundled payment, conceptually it's like Medicare giving a hospital a lump sum, a bundled payment, and that bundled payment covers the index hospitalization plus what happens 30, 60, or 90 days outside of that index hospitalization. So it forces the hospital to care a little bit more about what's going on with readmissions and post-acute care. And the flagship bundled payment program was called BPCI, or BIPSI. It was a voluntary program. It's been on the books now for 3 or 4 years, and I think is set to expire next year. And there was 48 different episodes. Cardiac valves was one of them, so we paid a lot of attention to what was happening within that valve bundle. And then a few years after that took off, the administration put out a mandatory bundled payment for hip and knee replacements. Medicare patients get a lot of hip and knee replacements, and that raised a lot of awareness because it was mandatory. It impacted around 800 hospitals in roughly 70 metropolitan statistical areas. And then in the last 6 months of the previous administration, they finalized a mandatory AMI bundled payment, a CABG bundled payment. I think there was a surgical hip femur fracture bundled payment. And those were set to go into effect January 1 of this year of 2017. And kind of to make a long story short, Trump got elected. He brought in to head HHS a guy named Tom Price. Tom Price was a congressman from Georgia, but before then he was an orthopedic surgeon in the Atlanta area. He had been very vocal that He was not in favor of mandatory payment models, that he thought CMMI should be testing payment models, but they're not there to mandate payment models. And so he delayed the implementation of that, and just 2 weeks ago, while we were on our planning call, CMS announced that they went in effect and actually canceled the AMI mandatory bundled payment from taking off, as well as the CABG bundled payment and the surgical hip femur fracture bundled payment. And not only did they cancel those, but they scaled back the CJR, which was the hip and knee bundled payment, which has been on the books for a while. So they scaled that back. So that's why I say maybe they've taken the foot off the brake, or taken the foot off the accelerator a little bit. They've also, CMMI is now looking to go in a new direction. So I don't know if anyone saw an article that Seema Verma published in the Wall Street Journal back in September. Seema Verma is the head of CMS, and they issued, in parallel to that article, CMS issued an RFI, a request for information, about which direction to take that CMMI in. So that's why I say I feel like, you know, we're still heading in that direction, but we might be going in a different
I think
direction.
Reggie has some things she'd like to
Yeah.
add.
So I'll be a little controversial, and I'll say I don't think Obama was really about value-based healthcare, and I don't think Trump is about value-based healthcare. If you go back to the definition that it's outcome as perceived by the patient divided by cost, I think Obama was focused on cost predominantly, because measuring outcome is almost impossible by the definition that we have right now. To your point earlier about everybody has a different view, what's important to me and what I like over what time frame for me to say the outcome is very different. And so when you put in place, for example, knee replacement bundled payments, the primary driver, and it's logical, right, is you look across the healthcare system and you say, in some places a knee replacement costs this much, and in other places it costs this much. There must be something wrong with that spread. It doesn't make sense that there's that disparity of cost. And that's true, right? And so you bundle it to try to bring the variability down. But that's all about cost, right? It does help the equation, so long as you don't give up on outcome. But I think it also does put at risk innovation, because when you bring out a new innovation, it is very hard to know out of the gate the total impact of its value, right? Unless you're going to do great big studies for a very long time, in which case you're postponing the implementation of that value to a broader group. And so I agree with you that Trump has taken the pressure off. I agree with you that it's not at a 180. I'm just not sure either one are really about the true value-based metric.
The equation, right. So assuming that we were going to move on from this piece of this, so actually taking a step back and looking at more of a global viewpoint, Belinda, you had commented about GDP, and I know we had a nice little thing about GDP, what's the point of it, and yeah, so I'd like you to talk about
You can't ask an economist what the point of GDP is. Because
Why don't you
that we're
fire
going
it
to say it's the best thing ever. That's what we teach in our classes.
Right, exactly.
No, but I think that what we were really talking about was, you know, why do we always focus on healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP? You know, why is that something that comes out? You know, it comes out every year. Something just came out recently that was measured. I think it was 17.9% of healthcare spending in 2016 was a part of GDP. So really it's so that we can see, okay, a lot of times, is this sustainable? So across time, how is that percentage changing? And really to compare it. I mean, it's a percentage so that we can compare it, it's a relative measure. But like you were saying, Reggie, you know, it's really just the cost part that this is focusing on. And so you have to see it in terms of also the outcomes. So it's not just the percent of GDP and what our healthcare spending is per capita. It's what are our healthcare indicators associated with that? Because if you think about it, if we're spending 18% of our GDP on healthcare, but Mexico is spending 6% of their GDP on healthcare, does that mean that we're obviously doing better because we're spending so much more money on it? Not necessarily. Is Mexico doing something great because they're only spending 6%? Not necessarily. So you have to think about what are the other indicators like mortality that could also play into a role of what are we getting for this expenditure. So
The only
Yeah,
thing-
so I was going
the
to say,
only thing
Suzanne,
is-
you're
yeah.
next.
I just want to make sure that we also appreciate that the cost is also appreciated by the patient.
Right.
Okay, and I especially feel it in diabetes, and especially for anyone who has a chronic disease or has a child with a chronic disease. The expense and the out-of-pocket cost is enormous. And so to the extent that we can continue to innovate and improve outcomes and reduce cost is completely appreciated by the patient as well.
Well, and actually that's the transition I was hoping to make next, which is to talk best examples of value and products that were designed with value at the core. And I wanted to start off with you in diabetes, Suzanne,
Yep.
to talk a little bit more about that and as it relates both patient-driven value and maybe touch on destination healthcare.
Yeah. So, and I think earlier, maybe yesterday, there was a talk on one of the innovations that we've had in the diabetes world and for Medtronic, significant product introduction, which is an insulin pump, which is like a hybrid closed loop. So it is as close as you will get to a pancreas. And I think that kind of innovation has had just tremendous impact in terms of patient care, quality of life, and also reducing cost, because as you can control a patient's insulin level and their glucose and keep it within a tight range, you're also reducing the probability that they're going to be hospitalized due to a diabetes-related complication. And also in the long term, you're also preventing diabetes-related complications that occur. And so it is a wonderful innovation from that standpoint, and I think is in the forefront of all of our engineers' minds as they're going through the product development process to make sure that it's checking all of the boxes. In terms of destination healthcare, something that we're doing at Medtronic that, we're trying to move from just being an insulin pump sensor company to really being a holistic diabetes management company. And what that means is moving beyond devices. And so what we have an investment in the Netherlands, which are diabetes clinics, where they have been able to put together an integrated practice unit. There's an IT platform that reaches out to patients, creates the engagement that's necessary, and is a true gap in care for the diabetes patient, and is improving outcomes and is reducing cost. And so, again, if you can start to funnel patients to a service that provides best-in-class care, has the latest in technology, improves outcome, quality of life, and reduces care, that could potentially be a model for the future. And I think that just in the standpoint of things changing, the recent acquisition of CVS Health, and the acquisition of Aetna, you're going to see massive changes and so here's a strategy where trying to, again, use brick and mortar to provide access to the best care possible. There's going to be a number of strategies, I think, deployed.
Well, last night, for those of us that were here, heard the Stacy Pugh discussion about how important getting to the right stroke center is, and that's clearly an example of, in a small way, localized way, destination healthcare, and it's also patient-driven value, right? So those are really, really good examples of that. I know that we wanted to talk also about Risksharing. There's a concept that, and it's funny because MedMark talks about Risksharing in terms of malpractice risk, but we're talking about Risksharing at the payer level. And I think, Matt, you had some interesting things about what's going on with AdvaMed right now on Risksharing.
There's a lot of excitement around risk-sharing or agreements or outcome-based agreements. We hinted at them a little bit earlier, where these are agreements a manufacturer makes with a payer or provider that basically says, we believe our product is going to perform in this way, and the payment will be justified based on how that product performs in a given patient population. I think the classic example is a drug company that develops a drug that lowers cholesterol levels, and if it doesn't work, then the company provides a refund on that payment. So I think there's a lot of excitement. My sense is it's still very much in its infancy. There's a couple of challenges to some of those types of agreements. One is from a legal standpoint, and I'm not a lawyer, but I know there are on the books anti-kickback statutes from a Medicare perspective that kind of are aimed to prevent an improper incentive to choosing one product over another. And oftentimes these risk-sharing agreements or outcome-based agreements fall into this murky gray area in terms of the existing legal infrastructure as it relates to anti-kickback statutes. So I know this is an area that AVIMED, our trade association, has been very involved in trying to carve out safe harbors, which will help define that legal gray space a little more clearly. And I assume if AVIMED is leading on this, it's because their member association is pushing them in that direction. So that's one challenge. I think another interesting facet of that is just data, and that to analyze and to kind of execute on those kind of agreements, you have to have some level of patient-level data to confirm what's happening to the outcome at a patient level. And then that raises the question of who has access to that data. Do you get it from an EHR? Do you get it from a registry? Who's analyzing it? And that sort of thing. So that's another challenge, I think, to some of these risk-based agreements. But there's certainly a lot of excitement around it. I would open it up.
And I remember Suzanne said you guys are doing some interesting things in that regard.
Yeah, so we have a couple of agreements. We have one with Aetna, where exactly, if we do not achieve the A1C levels that our product should bring, that we actually are on the hook to give a rebate back to Aetna. Now, Aetna's not going to tell physicians what to prescribe. So that's, we still need our sales reps going out there and doing their job, and ultimately it's the patient's choice. However, it's enough, I think, to hear that Medtronic is so confident with their product that they're willing to have skin in the game, that I think it's been helpful for us to discuss with HCPs and also with patients. We also have one with United Healthcare where we actually have a value-based agreement where we're taking a look at a patient that's on a pump versus a patient who's not on a pump, and look at an annual basis the total cost of care of that patient. The challenge in a chronic disease, and discussing with payers, is they'd like to see the immediate payback. And in a chronic disease, it's very difficult to show cost savings, And so what we have to do is put on a lens of how do we turn a chronic disease into an episodic, or an episode of care and capture value. So that's been a challenge, which is why I think a baby step is A1C. That's at least one metric that we know we can get the data and we can baseline it.
And are you guys the ones who are analyzing that? Like, how does
together, yeah.
So it's an open sharing of their data with you.
It's a partnership. Now, in many cases, the payers have an analytics arm that's much more sophisticated than what we have at Medtronic, but we're certainly involved with sharing our continuous glucose monitoring data so that we get the appropriate analysis.
So I'm actually curious, how long did it take you to develop those risk-sharing agreements? Because currently, as Matt's pointed out, the systems are not set up for it. So I imagine that you were really at the bleeding edge of trying to figure out what this thing would look like, all the legal ramifications, et cetera. So time frame?
I would say years. And I think that what's critical is you need to have top-down leadership to make it happen. If you're just trying to do it from a bottoms up, you're going into a payer organization and you're dealing with contracting, and this is a significant amount of brain damage. They really don't want to do it. If it requires any benefit change, it's a huge pain. And so you really need to get CEO to CEO to talk about how do we see our partnership in trying to have an impact on care moving forward. And that, I think, has been the key.
It takes years. Big lesson. Okay. So actually, Belinda, I'd like you to kick us off, and we're going to take a little bit of a turn here. And the next question for all of us to consider is, what are the barriers for medtech companies, and how are we handling them? And I know that you had talked a lot about what resources are available, all those things that you mentioned in the definition. Like, where could we go find the data? I know EGS found some interesting data, but where are places that you think you remember we could go find data that don't involve big studies, right? So what's out there already?
Right. Yeah, because I think that many times when we think of barriers, we think, oh no, we're going to have to go conduct an RCT and collect all of this clinical information and maybe have some piggyback study with economic data, but you don't always have to do that. You can use your own single arm trials and marry that type of information with information from publicly available data sources, external data sources that you license. So you can use Medicare data, for example. There are people who, if you have it internally within your own organization, or you can contract it out with other people who are experts in this data already, and they can be very reasonable, and they can do different studies on different procedures. They can be comparative studies. There's also more expensive data sets through Optum, through DRG, there's TrueVen, Premier has a really good data set, and you can use all of those different sources. As I said, they're kind of expensive to be able to conduct studies as well. I do think that there's pros and cons to the different data sets that are available. Many times you might have something that is longitudinal, but it might not be very deep. And in terms of very deep, I mean, you could have the line item detail to be able to find your device within an inpatient study, for example, in one data set, but you don't have that capability in another. So there are options out there. I think the biggest barrier for using this type of data is finding your device. I know that that's what we've had a lot of difficulty with, because there's no way of tracking it, at least not yet. But if you have an EHR with claims record, if there's that kind of data set that kind of connects it, there are ways to do it. So that's another kind of possibility where you can find your device. So those are kind of the ideas.
I'll throw in our experience. At EGS, we actually accessed some all-payer claims data as well as some Medicare data. And of course, we were looking at it. We did an Optum study as well. Yeah. And these were not inexpensive things for us to embark on as a small company. There's not even 70 of us in the company. So it was a big commitment. And what we decided to do is once we got through looking at all the data, a lot of us said, hey, wait a minute. There's actually some sales and marketing value in this data. So we actually, when we go and talk to hospitals and our customer physicians, we can show them information about the reflux in their specific geography. And it really helps to sell the concept of a reflux center, of which our product is just one thing that's offered. And so we were able to monetize our investment in that data that was being used on a reimbursement side, and we actually published a poster, and some of that data is making its way into our next study, just like you said.
Yeah, that's great.
And we were able to still use it in commercial use. So it takes a little bit of creativity, but if sales and marketing and reimbursement all get together, and you can really leverage the heck out of it and really make it work for you.
Yeah, and I would leverage that too, where we're at Edwards, we're bringing a lot of those databases in-house and doing a lot of that analysis ourselves, whether it's Medicare data or Premier, some of those databases, and we've also been using them with our sales ops team to really drive more insights onto the sales side of things as well. So it can be really rich source of a way to collect evidence retrospectively.
And actually, I'd like you to keep going because we talked about clinical society involvement, and Matt, you were going to talk about the Macro Coalition.
Yeah, so we, along with our government affairs team, are very involved in trying to shape this payment landscape a little bit, how I talked about earlier. So we're involved in a number of different efforts, if you will, to kind of lead this shift from volume to value. One of them is a coalition around MACRA. If you're familiar with MACRA, it reformed how physicians get paid in this country when they treat Medicare beneficiaries. So it ties their payment to the quality of care generally that they provide. So and just again last week, MedPAC, which is the Medicare Payment Advisory Committee, has come out and now said this one arm of this called MIPS, which is the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, they are now recommending that to be scrapped altogether, and we're only a year into that MIPS program. So we're myself and some of our government affairs colleagues are at the forefront of trying to work with some different organizations to reform MACRA. We're also involved with Duke's Health Policy Center called the Duke Margolis Center. We've got some folks on a committee that's, again, aimed at moving from a fee-for-service to a value-based payment center. So we actively seek a lot of these different organizations that are trying to shift the whole payment landscape, if you will. And it's at times it's a bit like sculpting fog, because you don't know where things are going to go or how they're going to end up, and it's a long process with a long horizon. But we think it's very important as an organization to be involved in these sorts of efforts. So I don't know if others.
Suzanne?
I was just going to say one of the other barriers too that I think we have in value-based healthcare and the ability to achieve the outcomes is the patient's adherence to their own care plan. And so even though we're developing devices and we're developing therapies, if they're not following the care plan, and in diabetes, 90% of the time they're self-managing their own disease, if we can't impact that either with easier devices or care coordination, we're not going to achieve the outcomes that we're setting out to impact. And so that's a barrier. The other is physician alignment. This is a lot of work for them. It's a lot of data, documentation. And I read an article on the American Academy of Family Physicians, and a higher percentage are using value-based, or they're participating in value-based payments, but the number one issue for them was just they don't have the time to collect the data. They feel like there's no transparency between the payer and the provider, and so there's still a simplification that needs to happen here in order for this to get really operationalized.
Any barriers that you'd like to bring up, Reggie?
Well, yeah, I would say not barriers, but some of the things that are breaking some of the barriers down. I think innovation and digital innovation is really, whether Obama and or Trump, accelerated or not, innovation's happening on digital, and that's providing the opportunity to begin to put patients in a much better place to care about managing their care. Both because they can go on the internet and look now. There are apps that you can follow anything in your life you want to follow, and it reminds you when you do the right things. There's more and more connection with your physician remotely. I think if you roll the clock backwards a long, long way, I had my primary care doctor, and he was my friend. Typically it was a he back then too. He was my friend and lived in my town, and he might go to the restaurant with me and remind me, and we lost all that as we grew as a society. And I think some of the digital in-home connection, the apps on the iPhone, are helping to bring that connectivity back in a way that is facilitating patients increasing their involvement in management. And if we're going to get that top part of the equation to work, the patient's got to be at the cornerstone of getting that to work. Yeah.
So I actually live in Mountain View, California, which most people don't know, except for that it's the home of Google. So I live in Google land, and yes, I have an Android. Cupertino's 2 towns over. So one of the things that I pay attention to, which you just touched upon very briefly, was telehealth. And telehealth, there's groups like HealthTap, and there's a whole bunch of others that are starting to come up. I just read not too long ago that Medicare, for the first time, they were saying that telehealth for years was illegal, right? Back to the legalities of some of these things. As of 2018, CMS put out a rule that said that they are going to pay for telehealth services, which means that people in rural cities or rural areas that are outside of the cities and suburban areas, or who have transport issues, they'll be able to log in, assuming they have a decent internet connection, and the doctor will be able to actually get reimbursed for that care.
Yeah, so I will tell you, it's been coming. In 2003, Medtronic got physicians reimbursed for managing a patient in the home if you had an ICD. Mm-hmm. But it was because the design of the program ensured costs couldn't go up. Right? Because a patient had to come to their doctor 4 times a year to have that device checked. All we did was stretch the telephone line, because they had a programmer with a little telephone line in the office. That telephone line went to the home, and you did the same exact thing you were doing in the office. And physicians got reimbursed right away. It took us a few years to get national coverage decision, but pretty quickly we got regional coverage decision. I think the barrier in 2003 to broadening access was the fear that we're going to get costs out of control, and the fear on the provider's part of, I'm going to be talking to these patients all day, every day, and I'm not even going to run my practice. And by the way, I'll get reimbursed 10 cents on the dollar. If they would have come in the office, I'd have gotten the full dollar. So it's bad for me. It's bad for the payer because it's going to increase the frequency of interaction, and I'm going to pay more. And I think what we're seeing today is a recognition that, again, with the digital changes that have happened, that we can do this without increasing costs and without increasing the burden on the physician so much that it's not economical to do it. So I was excited to see that.
Yeah, and
change.
we're also increasing the quality of the care that's provided. So to the top part of your equation, patients are much more accountable in that scenario. They have to show up in a different way, but they have to show up. So with that, that was the prepared questions that we had. I'd love to get some questions from the audience about value. Yes, hey, someone's gonna come, hopefully. Uh-oh.
Great panel, by the way. I love the questions and answers we're having. As we're looking to a value-based healthcare system, more and more costs are being shifted to the patient, and patients are making decisions about their health. Patients are not necessarily, or us as consumers are not very good at assessing our own risk. What about the concept of enabling patients, maybe by even making things like insulin free, for early interventions that would have cost savings longer term, and maybe not that longer term, even a year or 2 years down? Because sometimes patients are making bad decisions based on cost.
Yeah, I think that with the shift in, what this reminds me of is when pensions were the way that people saved for retirement, and we made this shift to 401ks. Now you can argue that that shift has not been great for everybody, but I think we're seeing the same thing in healthcare, which is it's been this benign, benevolent dictator doing all the things about healthcare, and now patients are really having to take ownership. So any comments that we have about how patients will deal with cost?
Well, I think it's a really interesting and challenging question. Again, if we look to different time frames, we've been in a time frame of fee-for-service, and if you were employed and had insurance through your employer, particularly, that you didn't carry a big burden of the cost. And so when you get to this question of value-based, and the top is as perceived by the patient, and I don't bury any of the cost, I'll take all the resources I can get, thank you very much. And so the question is, how do you deliver it in a way that enables the patient to make the right choice for the patient? And I'll use an easier example than diabetes, but stage 4 cancer, right? If we are all diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, same cancer, and we're all given 6 months to live, how I might want to be treated is going to be very different than how they might want to be treated. If you can link the economics to it, so go to Regina Herslinger at Harvard's idea of healthcare savings accounts being it, and let's forget the issue of how do you fund the healthcare savings account equally, but let's assume we could get to a place where we've funded a healthcare savings account, and we can all three pass it on to our children if we don't spend it all. So now we have total control of the money. I might choose to spend all the money in my healthcare savings account on every treatment I can get because it means everything to me to live an extra 2 months or 6 months or 24 months or whatever I might get out of spending that money. Whereas she might say, I've lived a great life. I want to leave that $1 million to my kid or my grandkids. And I'm willing to forego that treatment. But, you know, in this case, it's an easier one because it's easier to comprehend. I've got a defined period of life. I know what chemotherapy is going to be like, you know, and we could make a good choice. It is much harder in something like diabetes where I can take the insulin, but I don't feel any different today if I take it or I don't take it, right? I can read on the internet that if I don't take it long enough, I'll probably go blind, I'll probably end up with problems in my legs. I'll probably end up with an amputation. My life will be shorter. Does free make me want to take it today? And what's the motivator that makes me want? And I think that's part of the problem is back to where you started, which is what's important is different for every person, and it's just not an easy solution, that it's just not all about the cost of it, although I think cost shifting is having an impact.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say is I think the onus is on us to work with the payers if there is a lifestyle or behavior change that we need to have or a therapy that should be employed, that we make it easy for the patient to be able to access that, whether that's either reduced copay or no copay or some sort of aligned incentive so that they're making the right decisions that ultimately is going to have an impact on their cost. I mean, one example is, type 2 diabetes is probably the biggest volume of patients in terms of, the disease itself, but also as a comorbid condition. That now there is coverage for diabetes prevention programs so that there's simple things that could be done early enough to prevent the onset of diabetes later.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, if our equation is perceived outcome over the cost, are we still blocked by lack of transparency about those factors? Or do we need more awareness of what the pricing actually is on both sides, patients and maybe the physicians and everybody, and also some more better ways to share the outcomes, who's providing good outcomes, what's working. Are we missing enough data to really drive our own positive value-based healthcare?
So I'll answer that in terms of the transparency of the pricing. And I think that what's so interesting is that there's all sorts of different pricing, right? There's charges, there's costs, there's the prices of our devices, there's the reimbursement, there's all of these different factors, and each one matters differently to different people. So you could have a cost savings to a patient, but that might not be a cost savings to the hospital. And you could have a cost savings to the hospital, to the payer, this is usually the case, but not to the hospital. They want the revenue. So I think that's an issue. I mean, and that's just because of the way the market is. And it's, that's just the way it is. In terms of the outcomes, I think that there should be more transparency there, and I think that there are maybe more initiatives to try to have more transparency there. But I think that maybe as consumers, as we try more and more to look for what those outcomes are, we try to connect it to the different procedures and to maybe different devices, I think maybe there still needs to be more knowledge that needs to be gained. But I'll see
Anyone
what the
else
rest
want
has
to? Go ahead, Reg.
I think there's lots of challenges to the equation and to putting the patient in real control. If you go to the outcome, right, it is really hard to measure real outcome. And chronic disease, right, what's the time frame for the measurement? It's easy, if I'm going in for a hernia, it's relatively easy, right, because it's a defined period of time, it's a surgery, I can talk about how I feel after it, how soon I'm up and walking and able to go back to my life, although you still have variability from person to person and pain tolerance and what their life was before and after. So even simple ones are hard, but add comorbidities, add longer durations. There are some institutions working pretty hard now to try to figure out how to measure the top half of the equation, and I hope they make great progress, because I think that's hugely important. I think the denominator is equally difficult, because it's a lightning rod to focus on the cost of the device. Right, that's the easy one. It's a single line item, and we can focus on that. Then how do you measure the cost of the procedure? How do you measure the follow-up costs? Repeat procedure, if it's not within 30 days, it didn't get measured, so now was it caused, it's hard to know what the right answer is.
So I will make another call out to the audience. Any other questions? And I will ask our panelists, is there any final thoughts that you have?
I'll close with 3 summary points that I think are promising right now, right? The first is, I think we are moving towards measuring outcome, and I think that's great. And I think everything that's gone on in the costs and Obamacare and all of it is helping to propel us towards measuring outcome. I think that's important. Second, I think patients are becoming bigger and bigger players in the decision making. I think it's A, cost sharing that's doing that, B, the digitalization, the availability of digital. It is the next generation of kids who are helping parents with the digital. There's a whole lot of drivers for the digital side. And then I would say finally, I think we are moving the point of care closer and closer to the patient's home. And that enables the others as well. And I think that's sort of the third promising change happening.
And I would just
Matt?
say real quick that wherever we end up, I just hope, and we need to just be really vigilant, that whatever payment system we end up doesn't disincentivize the adoption of new technologies that you guys all have a great role in innovating on, because I think that would be a real loss to the patient and their, their health and well-being. So it's an area that I keep close attention to when I'm reviewing policy coming out of DC, is what impact does this have on our patients, on our customers, and on the adoption of those new life-saving technologies.
And I'll add that as you're innovating and as you're thinking of new products, always think of the patient. And I think that, as long as you think of that value to the patient and it's patient-centered, then I think that value will be realized. But you have to always think of that central patient benefit. I think that's really important from a value perspective.
And I don't have that much more to add, because I think that's pretty comprehensive. I would just say that this isn't going away.
Yeah.
Regardless of administration, this is the right thing to do, and it's the right thing from us as medical device manufacturers to continue to think about, that Harvard Business School equation, and so that we are keeping the patient outcomes, but at the relative cost where it makes sense.
Build that value from the ground up, I think, is the big theme here. So I want to thank our panelists, and thank you to Brian for inviting us.
Thank you so much.